Hi, I'm Ahmed Shahabuddin, and you're in the stream. Today, the race to become the next president of the Philippines. We'll talk about the frontrunners and what's at stake in the upcoming election. The Philippines is heading into the final days of a presidential election that some analysts say could alter the state of liberal democracy in the Asian nation. It's been a campaign smeared by election disinformation, and leading the race is the son of a former dictator. With us to get into all the details is our panel who are joining us from Manila. Lian Buan is a journalist who has been covering the campaign of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. for the news website Rappler. Richard Haydarian is a columnist and the author of The Rise of Duterte, a populist revolt against elite democracy. And Regine Cabado, a journalist who has been reporting on election disinformation for The Washington Post. And of course, we want you to be a part of this conversation live on YouTube. You can chat your comments and questions to our producer right here, and we will do our best to get them into the show. Let's get straight to it. I want to start by asking you, Regine, why is this being dubbed the most consequential or important election in history? What's really at stake here? Could you explain for our viewers?
Hi, Ahmed. It's basically because the hold of truth on reality is going to be tested in the upcoming election. In this election in particular, we are seeing a massive disinformation campaign that is working in favor and benefiting the frontrunner Ferdinand Marcos Jr., known locally as Bongbong, his nickname. This has been a decades-long, well-planned, well-funded operation that is cross-platform. It's on YouTube, it's on TikTok, Facebook. And basically, there are a lot of people who have been buying this very embellished narrative of the martial law years and of the Marcos legacy, with, in some cases, total denial of the corruption that went on during that time. And if he makes it to the presidency, it will definitely show how far gone the truth might be in our fledgling democracy.
And, you know, I like how you frame that, because we have an example of just that, someone who has been swayed perhaps by social media, and obviously social media always playing a very big role in all elections. I want to ask you, before we get to that thought, Lian, the campaigns really seem this time around to be driven more by personality, if you will, than ideology. Is that true? You've been on the ground. What can you tell us about Marcos Jr.'s contender?
You can see that it's driven by personality when you have loyalists of the dictator voting for the son because his father was the dictator. And they, as Regine said, they buy into that embellished image of the martial law years being allegedly the golden era of the Philippines. Marcos himself, Marcos the son, the frontrunner himself, does not give comprehensive platforms. He has run this campaign on the platform or a promise of unity. Hunger, unity, better internet, unity, better education, unity. And he does not apologize for that. For him and his campaign, they've studied the psyche so well that they feel like it's working. It's resonating with people. And even though he is a polarizing figure, he has sold himself, in fact, to be a unifying leader.
Richard, a unifying leader. We've heard Marcos Jr.'s campaign just there. And from many people, you know, being about unity. Unity about what exactly? Is it just the unity of two sort of dynastic leaders, Duterte, of course, and Marcos Jr.'s father? What is this unity that they're speaking about?
Well, it's a classic generic motherhood statement that really is vacuous. There's no clear policy implications here. We have seen that the frontrunner, Bongbong Marcos, has tried to avoid any legitimate debate, even debates that were sanctioned by the Commission on Elections. So unity is their easiest way of saying we don't want to have a really detailed debate, because once we get into details, that's where the devil comes in, right? And the devil, in many cases, is essentially the baggage, historical baggage of the Marcoses. I mean, I have personally dubbed this as the most consequential Philippine elections, at least since 1969, when this was the last time another Marcos was on the ballot. And once the father, Marcos, actually won the re-election in 1969, shortly after, he declared martial law. And since then, we have been living in the shadow of the Marcoses. So if another Marcos now wins, he could complete what Duterte could not complete in the last 6 years. Duterte really undermined the foundations of democracy in the Philippines, but he didn't have the discipline and wherewithal. And he's quite, advanced in age. Marcos, if he comes in, he can finish the job,
Right.
essentially push the Philippine democracy over the cliff.
And I see, Regine, you're nodding and you wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to maybe cut in a bit. Basically, definitely that is on the line this upcoming election, and the Marcoses really are benefiting from this decades-long rebranding. It's very strange because definitely in the international eye, in the world's eye, there is nothing alleged about the corruption and the baggage of the martial law years and the Marcos regime.
Right.
But it's so ironic because locally that's being contested by people who have lived through it.
Well, and it certainly seems, according to all of you, that there's a bit of revisionist history going on potentially, using the online playground, if you will. We have an interview with Al Contrada. He's a 25-year-old supporter of the Marcos family in general. He really talks about how the information he's seeing online is directly influencing his vote. Take a listen.
While I was scrolling down social media, there were a lot of articles about the achievements of Marcos's father. So then I got curious. I checked the articles and I saw how beautiful the Philippines were during the time under Ferdinand Marcos, how cheap goods were, and how much infrastructure he built, of which we are still using now.
You know, Richard, what do you make of that message right there? I mean, in 1986, People Power protests brought down the Marcos family for a reason. It seems odd to be back, as you said, 3 decades or more later, with this same debate between authoritarianism and the democracy. What do you make of that messaging? Is social media really impacting a broad section of the electorate?
Right. I mean, Ahmed, let me just clarify, because I think there has been a lot of millennial and youth bashing throughout the years. But if you look at the numbers, actually, the exit polls in 2016 elections, the reason why Bongbong Marcos did not become the vice president is because the millennials actually did not rally behind him. In fact, it was folks 55 and above, a lot of boomers, right, and Generation X, who were much more, I would say, much more given to the nostalgia for the Marcos era. But in this election, it's quite different. Now, I don't want to bash the younger generation, but we have the Gen Z generation, 18 to 22, very young people, and a lot of them are very active on TikTok platforms that were not really influential back in 2016. So this could be a different ball game right now. I think the millennials were not really harbingers of revisionism, but this time I think there's much more palatability in terms of the Marcos messaging to the Generation Z. And I think they have really focused on that. They knew they didn't do as well in 2016 in terms of the youth vote, so they have really focused on coming up with, I mean, you look at it, Bongbong Marcos almost looks like a K-pop star, right? If you look at some of his TikTok, videos, among others, and that clearly is catered to folks, very young folks, like the gentleman that we interviewed a while ago.
And it's interesting to hear you say that. We know that social media is all too powerful, not just with the millennial generation, but Leanne, I mean, Marcos somehow been able, Marcos Jr., I should say, to dismiss his own conviction of tax evasion and kind of the billions that his family still owns the government. Are these issues front and center? Is his challenger, Leni Robredo, whose central message is anti-corruption, managing to bring back the narrative, perhaps to a more realistic portrayal of history?
It should be front and center, but the fact that it's not being front and center is the price that we pay for having weak institutions, for not having a much better institutional remembering of what happened during martial law, for having a weak justice system, for having a weak anti-corruption system. And in fairness to the political opposition, they did and they've been trying really to bring those issues front and center. But we see the Robredo campaign actually co-opt the message of unity. They rebranded their logo. They're now saying they're going to win it for everybody. So now they've realized just how powerful and how capturing the message of unity is and would be in the last stretch of the election. So it's very sad to see how all of these took a backstage in this campaign, but that's a price we pay for years of shortcoming from all sectors of civil society.
Yeah, including the media, and I want to get to that in a little bit. I do want to ask you, Regina, to listen to this young man, Kenneth, a COVID-19 response volunteer, who makes a kind of passionate case for why he's voting for Marcos's challenger, Leni Robredo. Take a listen.
I'm excited to vote for Vice President Leni Robredo for president because of 3 reasons. First, VP Leni helped save my loved ones' lives. She gave my family members who are frontliners PPEs and helped our city manage our surge through our office's programs on free testing and patient monitoring. Second, VP Leni has zero record of corruption. She was given the highest audit rating 3 years in a row. Third, VP Leni lives simply and is the best person to fix many of our broken systems like public transport because she is a commuter like us and lives an ordinary life like us. VP Leni inspires many of us to take a more active role in politics and governance, and that is why VP Leni is my president.
I know the polls show that, perhaps Marcos Jr. is going to win, but do you think that Leni Robredo has a chance, Regine?
A lot of analysts would say that maybe she might have the momentum to pull off a photo finish. Maybe Richard would be able to weigh in on that a bit later on. But definitely one thing that the surveys did not measure is the engagement of the electorate. I've been on the ground with the house-to-house campaign for Leni Robredo, and I can definitely say that it's something that the Marcos camp thus far has not been able to replicate, really, because it took the Marcoses, even with social media, and while it's been so effective, it still did take them decades to make such a comeback and to be able to rehabilitate their name. But the momentum, the upward spring of the following for Robredo, who has been vilified for 6 years, there's all these crazy conspiracy theories that go on about her, all this fake news. But somehow she manages to come out of that with all this star power, all these celebrities who back her, and a really, I would say, unmatched volunteer campaign that's very creative, that's willing to counter trolls for free, to basically work as her online response team. That's definitely something to watch out for, even if she doesn't make the elections.
Richard, your thoughts? I mean, it seems as though this is an election in many ways about authoritarianism versus democracy. A candidate who wants to hold the system accountable, another who wants to continue to maybe steamroll it. What do you make of kind of disinformation, how it's playing in, and what we just heard about Robredo's real chances?
Well, I mean, let's be very clear about the situation here. Leni Robredo is not only against Ferdinand Marcos Jr., he's against the tandem, the axis of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte, the presidential daughter who's running for the vice presidency, but actually used to be the front runner in pre-election surveys for the presidency. So the moment Sara Duterte decided not to run for the presidency, that was around 30 points. That went to Bongbong Marcos. So Leni is really against a whole team. And that's the problem. That's why it's a little bit lopsided. The other thing we have to keep in mind is that actually Pew survey, World Values survey, when I was writing about the rise of Duterte, I had to understand where is this coming from. And one of the things I realized is that actually only 10 to 15% of Filipinos have expressed categorical support for liberal democracy. So Leni is working in a very democratically ambivalent, if not a democracy fatigue situation. That's why she always had an uphill battle. But I think there was also some tactical mistakes. For instance, we see an upsurge of house-to-house volunteers, grand rallies. But how I wish this thing started in January, February. She's challenging Marcos to one-on-one debates. Why now? You should have done that in December, November. So there was a lot of dithering on the part of the opposition that I think really played into the Marcos camp's advantage.
Right, and Leanne, I see you nodding there as we heard from Richard. I do want to share with you this clip from Rachel Khan. She is a project coordinator with a fact-checking alliance in the Philippines that was specifically set up to address really a global problem, not just in the Philippines, which is, of course, election disinformation. Take a listen.
I think disinformation is playing a very big role in terms of manipulating the public. And the public is not aware that they are being manipulated, and that's the sad thing. That their freedom is being robbed because they are not making an informed choice.
So, Leanne, in January, Twitter suspended hundreds of accounts that were promoting Marcos Jr.'s campaign and violating a lot of its kind of rules on spam and manipulating the platform. You just heard that comment from the fact checker there. I mean, is there hope that this will be a fair election?
I think it will be a fair election just because people feel like they made a choice. But I think what people do not realize is much of their choice has been influenced by fake news, by embellished stories, by algorithm. I see it personally in the people that I've covered. I see it in my own family. They don't realize that much of their opinion has been shaped by wrong things, by falsehoods. So, I mean, if you look at it that way, democracy is very much threatened, and we very much fear for where we're going if the line is going to be further blurred between fact and fiction.
And you know, Regine, when we talk about those lines being blurred, it's interesting to me, and maybe I'm wrong, please correct me. The Philippines doesn't really have any sort of rules or regulations on social media. It seems that they have regulations like most countries do in terms of campaign spending for media, for mainstream media, but that there's almost an exception, if I'm not mistaken, for social media, that there's no way to govern that. Is that true?
Absolutely. And this is why some academics and critics have definitely called out the Commission on Elections because of the outdated rules that surround social media campaigning in the Philippines. One thing that we know is definitely that a lot of campaigning, advertising is hidden through influencers. It's made or disguised to look like it's organic. And there's basically no way to know whether an influencer is on the politician's payroll or not. So unlike if an influencer is peddling skincare products, for example, on Instagram, you'd see that it's sponsored. But then they can, in politics, when they're marketing a certain politician, they can work that into any of their spiels, any of their content. It will look organic, but actually that person could be on the politician's payroll. And there's no way of measuring that or finding that out in the current system.
Yeah, I mean, lots of criticisms of the current system, not just the candidates from each different party. I do want to also share with you on YouTube some comments that have been coming in. One from Dot. Let me just read it to you right here. The Philippines actually, this one's better. This is just the sad state of the world in general, with the rise of alt-right authoritarian populists, Duterte, Bongbong, Trump, Brexit, Le Pen, Orban, Modi, Bolsonaro. So listing leaders, right, that seem to represent this sort of deepening divide. Richard, what can you share with us about the geopolitical implications? What might Marcos Jr.'s rule actually look like if he does, in fact, win?
Yeah, I mean, the Philippines is now actually a kind of open system, right? I was quite shocked in an interview I had with the spokesman of the Commission on Elections a few years back to know that we don't really have a kind of a robust mechanisms to make sure that there's no foreign interference in our elections. And the concern over foreign interference, especially by authoritarian superpowers, by China, by Russia, among others, has been something that mentioned by a lot of experts. But we don't have a smoking gun because we don't really have a clear supervision of what's happening. And the stakes are extremely high, extremely high. The Philippines is a U.S. treaty ally, but under President Duterte, it has been acting like not an ally at all, right? Much more ally of China. And the worry is that if Bongbong Marcos becomes the next president, he'll further tilt the country in the direction of China at the expense of our traditional alliances with America. Now, that is worrying for a lot of Filipinos because we actually have territorial disputes with China, not with the Americans. While Robredo, the opposition candidate, has emphasized the importance of revitalizing our alliances with the West and fellow democratic nations. So the geopolitical stakes are also extremely high, and there are many powers who have also a stake in who becomes the next president of the Philippines.
You know, it's interesting. We have a comment that was sent to us, and you really laid it out there in terms of what's at stake for the world. So to broaden out the conversation, let's listen to what Dr. Jose Ramon Albert had to share with us. He had some deep insight.
Some people find it surprising that Senator Ferdinand Marcos Jr., or who is called Bongbong, is leading by a very wide margin across socioeconomic groups. However, I'm not, because he has a very strong alliance with Sara Duterte, the daughter of the current president, who is very popular. What's more surprising to me is that he's leading even larger among very educated groups. And I think what we have to watch out for is whether those who are trailing behind would be withdrawing in the next few days, because that could be a game changer, but likely it's not going to happen.
It seems almost, I mean, is that viable? Is that just like hopeful thinking that that could be a last-minute game changer, a candidate dropping out? What do you think, Leanne?
I think it's very much between Robredo and Marcos now. And I think all of the supporters of Vice President Robredo are counting that the surveys have a blind spot. That, as Regine said, that they haven't taken into account the unprecedented ground movement of doing house-to-house nationwide. That's never been done before. Usually you do house-to-house for local elections. And so maybe we're in for a surprise, maybe not. But one thing that I can foresee in the future, whoever wins, it's going to be a volatile first 1 month or 2 months. If Marcos wins, all those thousands of people that showed up for Robredo are going to make their voices heard. If Robredo wins, the 56% lead, the people that make up that lead of Marcos are going to have their voices heard. So we're in for a very rough ride in the next month, 2 months, 3 months.
Interesting. I mean, you know, we have a lot of people on YouTube commenting, for example, Jay Fizzy saying we should stop calling him Bong Bong and call him only as Ferdinand Marcos Jr. to remind every supporter who they're voting for. Trying to say that perhaps even just that is in a way, you know, focusing on the personality rather than the politics. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, under his father's rule, thousands were tortured, were disappeared, were murdered, and you know, it's troubling to imagine that that's just being gelled over. I do want to say, on the actual policies, we've talked a lot about, you know, the politics of all of this, but it seems both candidates have made sort of vague pledges, if I'm not mistaken, Regine, to improve healthcare and fight poverty. That's kind of the overriding issue, or has been for many, many elections in Philippines history. Is that true, or is there a clear sort of difference between the two?
Like what Lian and Richard mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
There's a very vague promise of unity, but the platforms actually have not really been fleshed out. Partly because Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte have really refused to participate in debates, face the free press, and answer any questions. That includes both regarding controversies and basic policies like economics, pandemic response, etc. So they haven't been questioned there. In terms of pandemic response, Robredo has had a bit of a track record with being very active in terms of her programs. And a lot of her biggest endorsements now, a lot of the people who really testify are people who have benefited from her various programs over the years while she was kind of working silently. Definitely one thing that we're seeing with Robredo's campaign is that it's actually borrowing from the radical love model we've seen in Turkey back in 2019 when opposition went up against Erdogan. One thing that we can learn from that particular campaign is that they can't really attack these populists outright. So they have to cater to gut issues and basically court the electorate based on things that are basically closer to their heart than the drug war or human rights issues or social issues where they can be more moralistic.
Right. I want to share with you very quickly something that Ferdinand Bong Bong Marcos Jr. had to say on Facebook just yesterday. Take a look.
Sa gitna ng krisis.
In the middle of a crisis, we should brace and prepare for a better tomorrow where we are united. Let us turn our backs on disagreements and divisions, and let us embrace a unifying leader who will bring us a brighter future.
Sa darating na Mayo 9 ay kailangan din po tayong...
On May 9, we also need to be vigilant of our votes. Let us protect our decision, and let us not allow it to be stolen again from us.
So, Richard, watching that, we don't have much time left. I just want to get a quick take. Is that campaigning? Is that disinformation in of itself?
I mean, just look at the video. It screams nostalgia. It makes you think of his father. I mean, the way he dresses up, the way he looks, his hairstyle. I mean, the unity kind of a vague motherhood statement. It's something that his father also used to say, you know, that if you put someone like me, someone with political will, whatever that means, someone with strong will, then automatically and magically all of our problems are going to go away. That's why they don't want to talk about policy, because this is all about putting our confidence in some sort of fatherhood figure. And that's what he's doing by eerily actually trying to look like his own father.
And perhaps we should have talked about the patriarchy. Always seems like a very relevant topic when discussing politics in this day and age. Richard, Lian, Regine, thank you so much. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for watching at home. And see you next time. You can always follow us at stream.aljazeera.com.